Welcome to the Explainer. So, if you've ever put your money into a so-called green fund, you've probably had that little nagging thought. Just how green is it really? Well, you're not alone. Europe's regulators have been asking that exact same question, and they're rolling out a massive new rulebook to clear things up. We're going to break down what it all means for you.
It seems like such a simple question, right? But the answer has gotten incredibly complicated. So much so that regulators across Europe are finally stepping in. They're trying to protect investors, people like you and me, from claims that might be a little bit misleading about where our money is actually going. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to dig into the greenwashing problem and figure out why the old rules just weren't cutting it. Then, we'll look at the two big fixes on the table: some really tough new rules on what funds can call themselves, and a complete system overhaul. And finally, we'll wrap up with what this all means for you. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the greenwashing problem. To really get why these new rules are such a big deal, we have to look back at the old system and see why it was, frankly, failing investors. The number one issue that regulators are trying to fight here is greenwashing. You've probably heard that term a lot. It's basically when a fund or a product looks all shiny and sustainable on the outside, but when you look under the hood, the investments just don't live up to the promise. So the old system came from something called the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR. Now, under these rules, funds got sorted into two main buckets based on Article 8 and Article 9. Article 9 was supposed to be for funds with a hardcore sustainable goal, like fighting climate change. Article 8 was, well, for funds that just promoted greener social stuff. But here's the absolute key. These were never meant to be labels. They were just rules about what information a fund had to report. And hey, don't just take my word for it. This quote from the European Commission just hits the nail on the head. They said, the system became a de facto labeling system, and that it was causing massive confusion and actually increasing the risk of greenwashing. People started seeing Article 8 and Article 9 as good, better, best, which was never the point. Which brings us to Section 2, cracking down on names. The regulators knew they had a problem, so they decided to start with the very first thing an investor sees: the fund's name. And this first fix comes straight from the top. The European Securities and Markets Authority, or ESMA, jumped in with some brand new guidelines. And their mission was pretty simple: make sure fund names are fair, clear, and not misleading. In other words, if you're going to slap a word like ESG, sustainable, or green on your fund, you better be able to back it up. So how do they do that? How do they enforce it? Well, ESMR brought in a really simple but incredibly powerful rule that all comes down to one single number. And that number is 80%. This new rule is a game changer. If a fund has a word like that in its name, anything related to sustainability, at least 80% of its investments have to actually align with that promise. So for you, that means if you see a green fund, you can be way more confident that the vast majority of your money is actually doing what it says on the tin. And it gets even more detailed. It's not just about hitting that 80% target. The specific words you use matter. For example, if you use a word like environmental, your fund has to exclude fossil fuel companies. But a fund with the word social in the name doesn't. And if you dare to use the word sustainability, well, the bar is set even higher. Okay, so fixing fund names was a really important first step, but it's just the beginning. That brings us to Section 3, and this is the big one: SFDR 2.0. The European Commission has proposed a much deeper reform, basically a complete teardown and rebuild of the old system. You can really see the shift in thinking here. We're moving away from that confusing mess of Articles 8 and 9 and those super long disclosure documents. Instead, the proposal is to create a totally new system, one that's built from the ground up with simple, clear product categories. The whole point is to make sense for investors. So let's get into the heart of this proposal. The idea is to swap out that old clunky article system for three new, much more intuitive labels that funds can actually choose to use to signal what they're all about. So here they are, the three proposed labels: sustainable, which is for the most ambitious funds; transition, for funds that are focused on helping companies improve; and ESG basics, for those that are just getting started with integrating these ideas. The goal is to give you a really clear, at-a-glance idea of what a fund is trying to achieve. Now, to even be eligible for any of these new labels, a fund would have to meet two minimum standards. And this is totally separate from that 80% naming rule we just talked about. First, a big chunk of its portfolio, maybe around 70%, has to back up the strategy. And second, it has to get rid of certain harmful industries, like tobacco, across its entire portfolio.
And here's where you can really see the difference between them. The sustainable label is the toughest to get. It's for funds buying into companies that are already top of their class, and it means absolutely no fossil fuels. The transition label is for funds helping companies that are on a clear path to get better. And ESG basics, well, that's a broader category for funds that are at least screening out the worst offenders in a sector.
Okay, that brings us to our final section, and really the most important part. After all this talk about rules and regulations, what does it all mean for you when you're looking at where to put your money? Well, the whole point of these reforms is to make your life as an investor a whole lot easier. You should be able to compare products much more clearly. The paperwork you get should be shorter and to the point. And with these stricter rules, you're getting way better protection from greenwashing. Ultimately, it should be easier than ever before to find an investment that actually lines up with what you care about. You know, this entire massive effort is really built on one pretty simple idea. If we have more clarity and more trust in these products, more of our money will flow to the projects that are truly making a difference. And that leaves us with the big open question. Will these new, simpler labels actually lead to smarter, more impactful, sustainable investing? The answer is going to shape this industry for years to come. Thanks for watching.